was the summer of 2014, and for my son's bar mitzvah present, just like many Jewish parents, we wanted him to bond with the Holy Land. Oh, it worked perhaps too well. My husband had stayed back at the hotel, and our friends, my son and I, had just stopped in a pharmacy.
Run to the bomb shelter, sweetie, please hurry. I didn't hear the sirens at first, but the Israelis did. They're used to hearing these things. We ran to the back of the storeroom. It was a 12-foot by 24-foot windowless bomb shelter. My heart's pounding. Boom, boom. I hear it and feel the percussion of the exploding bombs. I'm trying not to get sick. I look at my 13-year-old son and I think I'll never forgive myself if something happens to him.
That's an excerpt from a speech I gave to the Orange County Jewish Bar Association. It was the first, but not the last time we had to run to a bomb shelter. Our adventure and my transformation is also the subject of my book, Blasted from Complacency, A Journey from Terror to Transformation in Israel. There is no chapter in a parenting book on what to do when a war starts and you're on a family vacation. Think touring extraordinary and sacred sites mixed with cowering in bomb shelters. I'm still trying to get over the Jewish guilt of taking my son to war for his bar mitzvah present. The impact of being human targets helped me understand the plight of Israelis living like this, and it also made me want to work on peace. How Israel is often described on the news is not what I'd seen with my own eyes. And I felt Palestinian parents also preferred their children playing safely in their backyards. The missiles exploded just near enough to blow apart my world as I knew it, forever changing me. And you'd never recognize my life today with what it was like then. I believe I found my life's purpose. Hello, I'm Penny ST, and I'm the host of Peace with Penny. Welcome. It's great to begin another episode in season 2 of Peace with Penny, especially with such an accomplished peacemaker. Rabbi Dr. Ron Kronish was awarded the Interreligious Friendship Group Award given by His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1999, and was instrumental in meetings with Pope John Paul II, bringing together Jews and Catholics and helping to acknowledge and heal wounds of the past. He is the founding director of the Interreligious Coordinating Council in Israel, or ICCI, which he directed for 25 years. He has been a main driver in interfaith dialogue and peace activism within and outside Israel. It is one thing to want peace in Israel, but to actually do the work through dialogue between Jews, Muslims, Christians, and others in the middle of a war zone in Israel and the Palestinian territories, that takes courage. He's now retired, a noted educator, author, lecturer, writer, speaker, blogger, consultant, the editor of 5 books, and the writer of his own, The Other Peace Process, Interreligious Dialogue, A View from Jerusalem. Welcome, Rabbi Ron. Since we began with your award from the Dalai Lama, let's pull up some pictures and talk about why you were given this honor. Here you are with the Dalai Lama. Can you talk about the award?
Well, thank you very much, Penny. It's nice to be with you. I'm happy you're starting with this. You see my big smile in that picture. That was one of the happiest days of my life. So the Dalai Lama came to Israel twice in the same year, in 1999. The first time he came, the picture we see here, he came with a group of Christians and Jews from the United States, led by a man named Richard Blum, who is a philanthropist, happens to be the husband of Senator Dianne Feinstein, and he always had an interest in the Dalai Lama, and he had a foundation that dealt with the Himalayas. So he and a fellow named Bishop Swing, an Episcopal or Anglican bishop from the Bay Area, brought together a small group of Jews and Christians to Israel. And we had a dialogue with the Dalai Lama for about 2.5 days. Wow. At the King David Hotel. You see KD in the picture.
Yeah,
in there. In the basement. And and it was an amazing experience, including we had a meditation session with him and his colleagues. But in advance of the meeting, it was kind of a seminar. One of the organizers sent me an email while I was directing the Interreligious Coordinating Council, and he said, "We're looking to have a reception for people in the interfaith community in Israel. Can you help us?" So I said, "Oh, well, I think I can help you." And we were a coalition of 70 organizations from all over Israel with Jews, Christians, and Muslims that we'd been working with since 1991. And so we put out the word, and we got a big crowd, and they came to the King David Hotel on a Saturday night for a reception. And then I was kind of surprised by this award. And we have another picture, which I didn't send you. Where,
is it this one?
No, there's one more.
Okay.
I probably didn't send it to you, where the Dalai Lama comes up to me while I'm speaking, and he taps me on the shoulder. Maybe I think I have it somewhere, and he says, "Congratulations!" And he starts to laugh. In other words, when I went to speak, I was turning around to acknowledging him, and he said, "Here I am," and he has this great laugh and this great smile. And so it was a very meaningful event. There were all kinds of distinguished people who were there. You can see in that picture, in back of him in the middle is Rabbi Shai Yeshiv Cohn, who was the chief rabbi of Haifa. Next to him is Qadi Ahmed Natur, who was the leading Muslim judge in Israel for many years. So it was a great honor for me and my organization at that time, not only to meet the Dalai Lama and watch him engaged in real dialogue, but to get this little honor from him. So yeah, it was a wonderful occasion.
Wow, that's just incredible. I can't even imagine what it'd be like to be able to meditate with the Dalai Lama.
Yeah, and we had a second, during the same year, there was an organization in Israel called the Friends of Tibet. And they were involved in bringing the Dalai Lama to another conference, which took place at the Sea of Galilee in a place called Beit Gabriel of the Southern Shore. And we spent, again, 2 or 3 days with the Dalai Lama and others, interreligious leaders. This one was more international, from all over the world. And it was just an amazing experience to be with him and be with others, because he has a great skill in dialogue, which we may talk about later, of really listening. I think in the 3 days, he maybe said 5 sentences, and most of the time he was really just taking it all in.
Wow, we all could use that talent, that's for sure. And we also have a picture of you with Pope John II, and you did some work regarding bringing together the whole dialogue and the history there of the Catholic religion. And I believe this happened around, was it just after the Oslo Accords?
Well, in a way, it began after the Oslo Accords, because after the Oslo Accords, the Vatican in 1993, in December 1993, decided to recognize formally and diplomatically, the existence of the State of Israel, and an agreement was signed called the Fundamental Agreement between the Holy See and the State of Israel, December 31st or December 30th, 1993, at the Foreign Ministry. This was not involving Pope John Paul II, but this began a decade of greater involvement with the Vatican in Israel. After that agreement, they began to send what they call a nuncio, or an ambassador from the Vatican, to live in Jerusalem and to work in Israel. And the person I know was a man named Monsignor Pietro Sambi, who spent 8 years here during that period. As the nuncio, we became good friends, and he arranged for me to go to several meetings in the late 90s and early 2000 at the Vatican, where 2 or 3 times I met John Paul II. This particular picture was from an interfaith conference for peace at Assisi, which is north of Rome, and you can see that Pope John Paul II was already getting much older. But I spent several years in dialogue with Vatican officials. In March 2000, this Pope John Paul II, made a historic pilgrimage to Israel for 7 days, and I was very involved in the media relations during that visit. And after the visit, my wife and I and a young Israeli couple made a documentary called "I Am Joseph, Your Brother," which traced the whole history of Vatican relations with the Jews and with Israel. We had the assistance of the United States, financial assistance of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. My good friend, Dr. Gene Fisher, was there at that time, and he helped us get a grant to produce this film. And we produced it in less than a year. And it was on ABC television all over the United States and North America. And it was really one of the great educational events of my life and my career. So yes, I had a period in my life where I spent a lot of time in dialogue with the Vatican, and I wrote several pieces about the Vatican and Israel and the revolutionary changes in the Catholic Church towards Israel. One of them being its recognition of Israel and seeing itself as a peace builder, as a neutral institution here in Israel.
Fantastic. I know that there's a story about, well, every time I've gone to Israel, of course, being able to place your note or prayer in the wall is always a moving and personal experience. And there's a touching story about Pope John doing the same. Can you talk about that?
So the day that Pope John Paul II went to the Western Wall, he was guarded by Rabbi Michael Melchior, and he went to place a note on the wall. And a few minutes later, I got a call from, I can't remember, CNN or BBC, or all these people were calling me that week. He said, "What did it say?" And I said, "I don't know what it said." And about 5 minutes later, it was on the internet exactly what it said.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure you can Google and find it. But basically what it said was that he expressed a message he had given in an Easter sermon before he came to Israel, kind of an apology on behalf of the Catholic Church to the things that happened against the Jews over history. So it was quite, and many other things he said and gestures he made. He went to Yad Vashem, he went to the wall. There were pictures and images that stayed with the Israeli people to this day. So it was a remarkable pilgrimage of reconciliation and peace.
Wow. So how do you think Christian and Jewish relationships have improved over the years?
Well, there has been, for a long time, as you probably know, in the West, that means America, Europe, a very healthy Jewish-Christian dialogue that actually began with the Catholic Church in its famous declaration called Nostra Aetate, where it entered a new era of dialogue with the Jewish people. So the Catholic Church, and that was in the early 60s, the Catholic Church gets a lot of credit, I would say, in my book, for beginning this era of dialogue from the 60s onward. And the Protestant churches were involved too. And I would say in the West, Jewish Christian dialogue has become a norm, a part
Sure.
of regular life. It's not anymore a counterculture activity. It's rabbis, priests, ministers, academics have all been involved in this. There is also in the world an organization called the International Council of Christians and Jews. In America, there's a thing called the CCJR, the Council of Christians and Jews, representing more than 30 academic institutions, seminaries, and others that have been doing Jewish Christian, and now more lately Jewish Christian and Muslim dialogue. So if you asked your question generally before you mentioned Israel, I'd say Christian Jewish relations has made tremendous progress in the last in the post World War II era. Now, if you want to know about Israel, that's a slightly different matter.
Sure.
Okay.
So what's your perception there?
Well, in Israel, I'll put it this way. The Christian-Jewish relations issue, if you want, is not a hot issue in Israel anymore. It may have been a while back, but as I like to say, the war with the Christians, between the Christians and Jews, ended a long time ago. It certainly ended in the 60s. And since we live in a region where there's a lot of war and violence, almost none of it is between Christians and Jews per se. So the focus here has shifted between those who were doing Christian-Jewish relations in Israel to those more and more groups doing either Israeli-Arab relations, that means Jewish Israelis and Arab Christians and Muslims, but more and more it's been Jewish-Muslim dialogue has become the more critical factor in I would say in recent decades. So that being said, there has been progress here too, but because the local Christians didn't always have the same Western education in terms of learning about the changes since Vatican II and all that, there's been a kind of lag in some ways. But I would say in Israel, Christians and Jews are very friendly with one another. And there's cordiality, and there are some groups who are doing Christian-Jewish dialogue and doing good things. But what I'm trying to say is it's not at a crisis proportion anymore. Our crisis is more between ethnic groups, Israeli Arabs, Israeli Jews, and of course between Israeli Jews and Palestinians, mostly in the West Bank and Gaza. But we'll get around to that, I guess.
Yeah, we sure will. In fact, where would you say we are regarding peace between Israelis and Palestinians, and why are we there? What I mean, just it's a big one.
Okay, so it's a complicated and long story, so I'll try to give you the short version because we only have so much time. Way back when, in the ancient 1990s, there was a thing called the Oslo process, which some of the people watching may remember. And in the early 90s,
so much excitement.
There were several agreements signed between Israeli government and the new Palestinian government. And there was an agreement with Jordan, and there was an agreement with the Vatican, and there was talks with Syria. So in the 90s, there was, I would say, a lot of hope for peace. In the early 90s, there was even a euphoria that peace was going to really break out. That all came crashing down in July 2000 with what was called Camp David II, when Prime Minister Barak and Arafat and Clinton couldn't come up with the formula to come up with an agreement as Carter, Begin, and Sadat did, or as Clinton, Rabin, and Arafat did. So after 2000 and up until now, for the last, we're now 21 years, the so-called political peace process has been basically frozen. Okay, there has been no real talk, no real progress, even though there were attempts now and then. And for the last 10, 15 years, because of the politics on both sides, there is virtually no political peace process. So we're not in good shape there, in my opinion. Where you can find peace activists and people working for peace is not in politics, but in the NGO, the non-governmental world. And as you probably know, because you're interviewing many of these people on your program, there are many, many NGOs in Israel, in Palestine, working on Arab-Jewish coexistence issues, working on Palestinian-Israeli cooperation. And if you come to Israel next time, I'll take you on a tour and we'll have you meet a lot of those people, and you'll go home feeling a little more hopeful than if I took you to the parliament or up to Ramallah to meet the political heads there.
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to skip over, because it's such a sore source, but the 67 war and the complications created by that. Could you just touch on those?
If you want to go back in history, it's complicated. All of the history complicated. One of the problems with looking at any of our events, 48 war, 67 war, is that there are two narratives of what happened and why it happened.
Only two?
Well, no, there's actually more. You're right.
I know.
People in the field talk about the double narrative, but now people are talking more about multiple narratives. That's true. On each side, there's what I call a meta narrative, and then there are as many narratives as there are political parties on each side. So, but anyway, the 6-Day War created a new reality where Israel, in a war of self-defense, occupied the Sinai and the West Bank and Gaza, and didn't quite know what to do about that. Early on, there were people who right away wanted to trade land for peace, but that was not carried by the government of that time. And so it took actually several years until the peace with Egypt, which is 1979, but began when Sadat comes to the Knesset 4 years after the October War, and the peace with Egypt, which was promoted heavily by groups like Peace Now and other peace groups in Israel at the time, was a major sea change in the world we live in here. Back in those days, Egypt was Israel's major military enemy, and a peace, or even a cold peace, even an armistice with Egypt, is better than no peace at all. And that peace is held for more than 40 years. And Israel, with a right-wing prime minister by the name of Menachem Begin, gave up territory for peace. He gave up the Sinai, the whole Sinai, for peace. And we thought, or many of us thought, that that exercise could have been repeated by so-called right-wing leaders in Israel later, who would have gotten the idea from Begin that you need to trade land for peace. That's been the formula talked about for a long time, even some land for peace, if not all of it, but at least some. So we did have the peace with Egypt, but basically after 67, we created a situation which has gone on now ever since then. That's it's more than 50 years, where there's a military occupation over the West Bank and a military siege in Gaza, and various Israeli governments have not sought to end that situation in exchange for peace. So we're kind of stuck now, and we're in this post-67 thing, which has gone on for so long. And one of the things it led to was the development of settlements, as they're called, all over the West Bank, depending how you count, with East Jerusalem, 500, 600,000, maybe more, And everybody knows that it's going to be by now very hard to uproot those settlements and those settlers for peace. So we're in this post-67 thing for a long time, and there doesn't seem to be any quick way to end it being offered by any politician right now on either side. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah. Are there any areas that, I know you're an optimistic kind of person, are there any areas that you see as optimistic as far as working on peace?
Well, you know, I've often spoken about two parallel tracks to the so-called peace process. One is the political, diplomatic, international relations peace process, which, as I say, I believe is frozen. And the other is called the peace building process, which is people-to-people work between Palestinians and Palestinian Arabs and Israeli Jews, which is going on in many, many organizations. Last week, I attended an event in Jerusalem called Middle East Storytellers. It was put on by the Alliance for Middle East Peace. The Alliance for Middle East Peace is an organization that started, I think 2002 in Washington.
Huda, the head of,
Yes.
the current head of
The regional director was on your program.
Yeah, she started our season 2. So.
Right. And so if you met Huda, you know she's full of high energy. And
yes.
She was the chairman of this event. And she told me, we met beforehand for an hour or two, talking about that the Alliance for Middle East Peace now has 160 different groups.
Right.
And when you meet these groups, some of them are small, some of them are big, some of them are in Israel, some of them are in Palestine, some of them are based in America or Canada. So when you meet a lot of these folks and you read some of their visions and you hear their not just their talk, but their actions having to do with peace and reconciliation. I like to say about these groups, they keep a flicker of hope for peace alive in the region. Okay, many of them have not given up on the two-state solution. Some have. Many of them are apolitical, just bringing people together to learn about each other's narratives and identities, and but they do a lot of good work, and I'm happy that they're there. The organization I led for 25 years was one of them, and we were one of the founding members of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. But I think it's only one of many groups working for peace between people in our region, and I'm happy they're there, and I'm happy that you're interviewing many of these people to get the word out about what they do.
And it's so interesting to me because they take it from so many different angles, whether it's working on tech together or music, or next week we'll be speaking with an organization that has Palestinian college students teaching Arabic to Jewish Israeli elementary school students. And there's just a myriad of ways of doing it, and certainly gives me hope, and I hope many others, but also I've begun talking with an organization called Anachnu, which means we, and they've studied with many different peace activists and government people, etc., and they have their own ideas of bringing about peace. So when you look at the papers, and at least in the US, and you see so much violence that's reported, and not much, if at all, about that there really are people working on peace. It could be very discouraging, and you don't think, anybody cares about peace, but it's not true. And that is the whole point about Peace with Penny. I want people to know there is hope, and I've just thoroughly enjoyed meeting so many people who do care, do work on peace with one another. It's very inspiring.
I once attended an international meeting in Italy with a group of people from the Paris Peace Center, and I met a academic named John Galtung, who was from Norway, who developed a field called peace journalism, meaning journalists who would write more about these things and promote it, because let's face it, journalists aren't always objective, and many of them have an angle. And I've always felt, apropos what you were just saying, that the mainstream media has not been our friend. They're not interested in these topics, certainly not front page, maybe sometimes back page human interest, but they have not helped us, not inside Israel and not in the world. I can remember once attending an international conference of a group called the Community of Saint Egidio, a wonderful Catholic group based in Rome that would have a meeting once a year they call it International Gathering of Peoples and Religions, and they brought people from all over the world in different cities in Europe. And I was giving a talk one day about things we were doing and things other groups were doing, and there was an archbishop from Mozambique who raised his hand to ask a question, but instead of making a question, he made a comment, and he said, "You're the first person I ever heard from Israel talk about these things. I had no idea that there was anybody in Israel working for peace."
Right.
So, I never forgot that. And, that's actually why, I don't know, about 10 years ago, I started writing blogs more for the Times of Israel and using social media more. And that's why I'm happy to be on your program. I was interviewed.
Thrilled for you to be here.
A few weeks ago from a Muslim woman, I think I told you about a Muslim woman from Johannesburg, South Africa, who came on a trip to Israel with a group of Jews a couple of years ago and was exposed to all kinds of peace groups. And she started an interview program very similar to yours, and I was one of the first people to be interviewed. And I'm happy to help get the word out wherever I can. So
yeah,
yes.
Well, the old expression.
Pardon?
I'm sorry. The old expression in journalism about if it bleeds, it leads, and we're trying not to have people being harmed. And to me, it's much more exciting to have people who want to work together and get along, and much more obviously productive. You, after decades working on peace between Israelis and Palestinians and in interfaith dialogue, you wrote the book, The Other Peace Process. Can you tell us about it and what the other peace process is?
Thank you. Well, after I retired in 2014, I sat down for a year or so, and I said,
it only took you a year?
It wasn't, I didn't have to do a lot of research.
It's because you knew so much.
It was all in my head.
It took me 5.
Anyway, it just came out. And what I tried to do is to write a book about everything I'd learned in my 25 years of working in this field in Israel. Previous to that, I had published 2014 an edited book called Coexistence and Reconciliation in Israel, where many of my colleagues, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim, wrote essays about what they had been doing and thinking. This book was to summarize what I learned, to tell some of my best stories, what I consider, the best moments that I had in my dialogue experiences over the years, and I think the final chapter was called something like Lessons Learned. What are what are the main lessons and insights that I got out of this. And so the other peace process was the title of an op-ed that I wrote, I think something like in 1994, that the Jerusalem Post gave to an op-ed that I wrote, which basically described the work of the NGO people, the non-governmental people acting for peace. And I liked that title, and so I took it from there, and I've used it ever since. And so it was mainly to describe the work of peace building in the context, of course, of what was going on politically all the time. But the focus of the book and the focus of the book I'm working on now is not so much on the politics, but on what I call the peace builders, their visions, what they would like to see, and what they've been doing to try to make that come to pass. So yeah, that was a fun book to write.
Wow.
And I'm seeing on Zoom a good friend and colleague, John Palacowski in Chicago. Hi, John. Who I remember I saw at a conference in New York a few years ago, who had not only read the book, but wrote a very nice review of it when it came out. So
Mazel tov.
It was well received, and I'm glad I did it. I know now that it's used in some academic courses. People in various places have used it, and so forth. So yeah, it was a fun experience for me. It was just to put down everything that I'd learned. I even wrote, going back to the Vatican, I wrote a chapter on the whole business of the Vatican and Israel. Some of the things that I was telling you earlier, I just sort of slipped that in there somewhere, because I always felt that in the peace process, that was a forgotten element. And since I happen to know it well from the inside, I thought it was really cool that 3 months after the Oslo Agreement, there was an agreement between Israel and the Vatican. And I like the world to know about that, because you know, in the Jewish Catholic dialogue that had gone on for decades that I was involved in before, the Jews would kept saying, when is the Vatican going to recognize Israel? And here it happened. I saw it happen. So I think it was a big step, not only from the point of view Jewish Catholic dialogue, but from the point of view of the political situation, because as everybody knows, the Vatican is a little city state as well as a church. So it was a great moment and an important moment, I think, and it's helped out a lot. I think I'll never forget that week when Pope John Paul spent a week in Israel. The month before that, there was terrible worry in the Israeli press. I have somewhere a whole folder of all the articles about what's going to happen and how are Jews going to behave and what's going to go on. And, you know, there's all this anti-Catholic sentiment because of history. Anyway, when Pope John Paul II came, he melted everybody down. It like instant. And one of the amazing things was that on public television, they would show every day what the Pope did and where he went, what he did. And there was a cross on Israeli public television. And I said, nothing happened. The TV didn't blow up. Everything was fine. So it really changed perceptions in Israel in a very, very major way. And I hope they're lasting.
Speaking of accomplishments, and I mean, you have so many and have done so much for decades, but I'm curious, what are you most proud of and why?
Well, I would say two things, maybe. One is the film I mentioned, I Am Joseph, My Brother, which last year we finally put up on YouTube.
Yes, yes.
We had it in only
I saw.
As a disc, if anybody remembers what a disc was. First we had video, then we had disc, and now we finally put it on YouTube.
I have to say guilty about that. I do remember.
So that
the fact I remember it is a good thing.
Yeah. And the educational process that led to it, and we showed it in Rome, and we screened it at many academic conferences, and I think I always think it was one of my major accomplishments, I have to admit, with the help of my wife, who
Yes, I
helped
know.
to write the script and do the research, and
And directed it.
we learned a lot. The second thing I would like to point to is an interesting story that it'll take me a minute to explain it to you. Through my organization, starting around 2002 or 2003, which was the height of the Second Intifada, embarked on a project which we called Kedem. Kedem was Hebrew acronym Kol Dati Mifayes, Voices for Religious Reconciliation. And we put together a team in the first year of 7 Orthodox rabbis and 7 Israeli Arabs, mixture of mixture of Muslims and Christians. And we spent a full year in dialogue. The second year, we doubled the number. And for 5 years, we had this group of religious leaders, local religious leaders, including one who became the Minister of Education, one who almost became the Chief Rabbi. It was one who became the head of the Qadis. It was a very influential group. And we got involved in what I call deep dialogue. We took the group to Northern Ireland, to Sarajevo in the summers, to Cyprus to learn about other conflicts and how religious leaders in other places played their role in helping to mitigate violence and to lessen hatred in their conflicts. And the religious leaders who were involved in this did a lot of important projects back on the ground, and we had some really amazing dialogue sessions, which I wrote a lot about in that book, The Other Peace Process. There were a lot of really great stories. So I'm very proud of that we managed to do that for 5 years. I wish it would have gone on longer, but there were circumstances which forced it to end, mostly having to do with too much violence between Israel and Palestine. So that's the second one. The third one I'll mention is through my dialogue experience with Palestinian Christian Muslims, I've developed some, I would say, lifelong friendships, which are professional, by now also personal. One of them is with a fellow you're going to interview in about a month named Bishop Munib Yunan.
Yeah.
Who was the Lutheran bishop for 20 years here in Jerusalem, became the first Palestinian Christian to be head of the World Lutheran Federation. And we led a dialogue group together called the Jonah Group for many years, where we brought together rabbis and Jewish educators, and he brought various local Christians, Palestinians, Anglican and Catholic and Lutheran, and it was really, really interesting stuff. And in, I think it's January 2002, I was invited by then the Rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in New York, Rabbi Ronnie Sobel, to attend a clergy institute that he ran every year in New York. And he wanted me to bring 2 colleagues along with me. And one of them was Bishop Yunan, and there was another Muslim educator who came with us. And we went to Temple Emmanuel, and then we went to several other cities, Chicago, Boston. We spent 9 days on the road together. And every time we would have our initial opening presentations, my friend and colleague Bishop Yunan would say something like this. He would say, the root problem of why we don't have peace here between Israel and Palestine is the occupation. And every time in the question period, someone would ask me, what did I think about what Bishop Yunan said about this root problem? And I would say, there are 2 root problems. One is that, and the other is the refusal then of the other side to recognize our right to exist and secure borders. So this went on for 9 days.
Mhm.
And a few weeks later, we're back in Israel. There was a conference of rabbis. It's called the CCR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. I'm a Reform rabbi, and I was attending the conference, and I offered a workshop at my center, the ICCI Education Center, for rabbis to come. And about 30 rabbis came to my office, and the three speakers were myself, Bishop Renown, and this Muslim fellow. And we all made our presentations, and then one of the rabbis asked Bishop Renown, what is the root problem of the lack of peace in the region? And he said, there are two problems. And since then, frankly, he said almost all the time that there are two problems, and that the need for peace is on both sides, and both sides will benefit from peace. It's in Israeli interest and in the Palestinian interest to end the violence and to live with the benefits of peace. So I remember that story because I say that was a good experience for me when dialogue really worked.
Wonderful, wonderful. Although there are probably a couple more reasons too, but so you founded and ran the Interreligious Coordinating Council in Israel, ICCI, for years. And why did you start it? And thirdly, how have you used interreligious dialogue to influence the way you do peace work between Israelis and Palestinians?
Okay, so in 1991, when I founded it, there was another organization, I won't mention the name because I don't want to get into intra-organizational politics, which was falling apart.
Okay.
And a small group of people came to me and some other people and said, we need to do something new because the established organization that had been in this field for a while was just falling apart and people were leaving it. So 4 or 5 of us got together and we said, okay, here's our idea. Instead of an organization of individuals, we'll try to create a council of institutions and invite to the group, to the coalition, any organization or institution in Israel which is interested in understanding and cooperating with the other in our society. And so we started on January 16th, 1991, the night before the Gulf War. And within a few years, we grew and we had about 70 different member organizations all over Israel who were interested in working together on these things. In addition, we joined 2 international organizations. One was called the International Council for Christians and Jews. And that's where I first met John Palacowski at a meeting of the ICCI in Poland, in Warsaw, in the early 90s, and others. And we also joined a second international organization called the World Conference of Religions for Peace. Then it changed its name over time to Religions for Peace International. And we became the Israeli chapter of Religions for Peace. So once we did that, that helped us define who we were, okay? Also, since we started in 1991, we grew up alongside the peace process of the 90s. 91 was the International Conference in Madrid, 93 was Oslo, 94 was Jordan. So we kind of grew up with that. And in recent months, I've gone through some of my archives and I found 1993, we started a 3-year process called, right after Oslo, called Educating About Each Other in the Era of Peace, which we did with a Palestinian group in East Jerusalem at that time, because we thought after Oslo, we were in the era of peace. In 95, the 3rd year after Rabin was assassinated, we changed it to at the beginning of the era of peace because we didn't think we were quite there yet. So we grew up alongside the peace process. And once we became part of Religions for Peace, we adopted the idea that interreligious dialogue was a method, and our goal was creating peaceful relations between people. Okay, so that's how we kind of developed over time from an organization. It started out as just doing dialogue between people of different religions, and we grew to be an organization. It was Interreligious Dialogue for peace. And at one point, I remember one year we had to, we were developing our first websites, and somebody said to us, "You need a good slogan on your websites that will catch people's attention." So we created one. It said, "Peace is our goal, dialogue is our method." And then after we did that, someone said, "But you didn't bring peace." So we changed it, and we said, "Peaceful coexistence is our goal. Dialogue, education, and action are our methods," which in one or two short sentences kind of summed up what we tried to do. We wanted to create the opportunity for Israeli Jews, Palestinian Arabs to coexist, to live peacefully in the region. And dialogue was one of the ways we contributed to making that happen.
Well, there's so many issues between Israelis and Palestinians, and I wanted just to throw out a question for you to teach us a little bit about. I know that you could teach for years, but I just wanted a taste of, okay, so although Israelis and Palestinians often live close to one another, they remain segregated and don't even speak the same language. How does this impact their desire and understanding of what it would take for peace to be a viable option?
Okay, that's a good one. It's a hard one. So I will divide this question into two parts. Within Israel, Israeli Jews, who are about 75%, most of the time peacefully coexist with Israeli Arabs or Palestinian Arabs of Israeli citizenship, even though there are problems. So Israeli Palestinians vote, protest, go to court, have full legal rights, but suffer from unequal budgets and things like that. But they can work on these things with Jews, including politicians, to improve their lot. And there's a lot of communication between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, although there is still a problem that Israeli Jews don't know Arabic well enough, but more are beginning to learn, certainly those who are working in the NGO field. On the other hand...
So I'm sorry, they're using English? They know Hebrew?
Mostly Hebrew. Most Israeli Arabs know to learn Hebrew in school and can speak a modicum of Hebrew. But if you want to do it on an equal level, as we used to do, you do it in Hebrew and Arabic and use a translator right now. On the other hand, in the Palestinian areas, the Palestinian Authority, there is another situation of occupation, of unequal rights, of security issues all the time. And there's a lot less communication. And actually, in the pandemic era, with more and more Zoom, there's been more communication between Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza with Israeli Jews than there were in many years beforehand, because of all the security issues and the fears of violence. There isn't much interaction. There's a little bit, but not enough. So it will vary from place to place, whether you're living in Israel proper, and are a Palestinian Arab citizen, and therefore in dialogue with Jews on almost every level, or the tougher situation in the West Bank, and certainly there's nothing going on in Gaza.
So, which kind of leads me, and I I hesitate to ask this, but I really want to know what your opinion is. So I will ask you, and forgive me. But do you agree or disagree with the common Palestinian narrative that Israel is an apartheid state?
I don't like the use of the word apartheid. I think it's a nasty word, and it's those who are using it to be nasty. So I don't.
I wasn't trying to be nasty.
No, I don't mean.
But it is what you hear. It's what you hear all the time.
Yeah, there was an article in one of the papers today about that. First of all, the state of Israel, if it's an apartheid state, it's only an apartheid state in the territories. It's not an apartheid state within the state of Israel proper. But I don't use that word. I would say that Israel is a state that has, in the administered territories, in the Palestinian areas, is enforcing an occupation on another people that is oppressive, that is humiliating, that is really terrible, that has some of the symptoms of what some people might call apartheid, but I wouldn't use that word. But it's not a good situation. And
right,
it's not going to. But as long as we're on that, it's not going to end by just calling people names and labeling it X, Y, or Z.
Sure.
I do want to say one thing about the word occupation, and I did write a blog about this last year, a blog post. The occupation is not going to end by itself. The occupation will end as part of a peace process. Any attempt to unilaterally end it, like we did in Gaza, won't work. So I know there are a lot of people who are what they call anti-occupation activists, and I understand what they're really fighting for the rights, the human rights of disenfranchised Palestinians. But going out and just screaming in the streets to end the occupation won't do the job. What we need is a peace process where both sides compromise, what we used to call making the painful compromises for peace. And here, once I'm on that topic, I want to say one last word, which I always like to, I would always end my speeches abroad in this way.
Wonderful.
There are two complementary processes here. One is the political peace process, and we need that to come back someday. I understand it's not happening tomorrow morning, but we can't resolve the conflict without it. Okay, so we had the beginnings of it in the 90s. Then it's dissipated. We need another peace process, I believe. Okay, we need a political peace process to put an end officially to the violence, to end the conflict officially. Then we need to be aware that the political process does not solve all of our problems. In addition to an agreement, a piece of paper, we need the work of all the peace builders, the rabbis, the qadis, the ministers, the youth workers, and a lot of the people you're talking to create the possibilities of living together in the long term, okay? So we need both processes. Right now, we only have one, the peace building one. Eventually, we need the political one to come back to help us end the constant wars and the violence and give us an opportunity for peaceful living in our region.
Amen. Thanks so much, Rabbi Ron. Speaking with you is always filled with lessons about both history and humanity. Next week on October 19th at 11 a.m. Pacific time, we'll be speaking with Ishmael Ben Israel from AMAL, which is Amal, the Hebrew acronym for Spoken Arabic for All. Established in 2010, Amal is a nonprofit Israeli organization working to mainstream Arab culture and refute the negative stigma towards it in the Israeli society by teaching spoken Arabic in Hebrew-speaking Israeli elementary schools. Arab college students receiving scholarships teach the Israeli children Arabic. By making the knowledge of Arabic and Arab culture more accessible to Jewish non-Arabic speaking children, they aim to promote an atmosphere of peace, tolerance, and mutual respect between Jews and Arabs in Israeli society. Amen. As always, we wish you a good week, and may we all live in peace, shalom, and salam.